All right. Well, welcome back to the Small Business Mindset. I'm excited today to have Jeremy Ames on the show with us as our guest. He is the CEO of Guidant Financial. And I think what piqued my interest in having him as a guest on here is that he's helped over 30,000 entrepreneurs start businesses. And it's interesting a little bit too. I want to hear a story and I want to hear how he interacts with his client base, but he has a focus on individuals and midlife. So these are not young 20 somethings necessarily, but people looking for to do a major career change. And how do you put that all together? And more importantly, how do you find capital to invest in something like that in the midlife of your life and having all the responsibilities? So Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kirsten. Glad to be here.
Could you tell me about this is an interesting concept and I'm interested in this because I also own a business. You own a business. I invest in property. I think building wealth is something that is always top of mind for myself and my clients. And I imagine it is for you, but you're a financial planner by trade, but I love you've taken a different spin on how to look at wealth building for this perspective. Can you kind of tell us the background? Why did you get into this and why is this important to you?
Yeah, the origin story.
Absolutely.
Okay,
I
so I'm
always like
actually
the why behind
yeah,
everything.
I'm not a financial planner by trade. In
You're
fact,
not? Okay.
yeah, what I did in my former life was I owned a real estate brokerage that was focused on uh, initial investors. So we would help people get into investment real estate. That was the primary thing that we did.
Okay.
And I did a bunch of stuff on side projects myself. And I got introduced to my business partner of 23 years, David Nilsson, through just some mutual contacts. They said, "Hey, here's another young guy. You both like Michael Jackson music. Maybe you guys should meet and you'll hit it off." So we did. We hit
That's
it off, and we started doing some projects together. And one of the things that we did was we were working on a raw land development deal. We're over on the peninsula in Seattle near the Navy base that was there. We thought there was a real opportunity. So we bought this piece of land and we subdivided it into different plats. And then we went to this group of attorneys that we knew because we wanted to structure it so we could do some waterfall fundraising. So we would put each of the plats in their own LLC, and then we could fundraise for one and start the construction on that. And our whole strategy was put a foundation down, drop a mobile home on top of it, secure it to the foundation, and now you're available for FHA, Freddie Mac financing, right? Because
uh-huh.
you can pay a
Okay.
mobile home off title. So that was our whole strategy. And we're talking to these attorneys about setting up this funding structure. And they said, "Hey, have you considered using self-directed IRAs?" And we said, "What are you talking about?" Right? I was, 25-year-old kid. I thought I knew all the things there were to know about real estate because I had this real estate brokerage that was helping people who were investment real estate. This was new to me.
Sure.
And, what was surprising about that was I was in this investment community going to the real estate investment clubs and I hadn't heard of it. So I said, "What are you
Hmm.
talking about?"
Hmm.
And they explained to us what was available there. And when we took it out to our network, we ended up getting 2/3 of the funding for this particular project through people's retirement accounts. People were super excited about this idea. And of course, when we went to them, we said, "We absolutely know how to do this. We can help you with this. We can take care of all the details if you want to invest your retirement funds." And then we went back to these attorneys and said, "Oh my God, all these people want to do this. You got to help us figure out how to make these happen."
Right.
And my partner and I walked away from that with a bigger observation. And our observation was it felt like no one really knew that this was an option. And it was eye opening to us to learn that this option had been around since 1974 when ERISA was passed. And B, even once you did know it was available, it was super confusing. Even as we were trying to help people set up these accounts, the only people who worked in this space were attorneys and bank custodians. And guess what language they don't speak? English. So it was this constant like call different people, get different answers. And so we just felt like there was a real opportunity if someone could make it approachable for an average investor to be able to use their retirement funds to do something more creative or that they were going to be more involved in than just stick it in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds and don't think about it
Mm.
until later. And so
Sure.
when we started Guidant, our focus was really helping people use retirement funds to invest in real estate based assets, some tax liens, things like that.
Hmm.
And our real breakthrough for the business came about 4 months after we started the company when our friend who was a CTO at a local business said, "Hey, you guys should start advertising on Google." We said, "Google, the search engine?" He said, "Yeah." And this was in 2003, right? So we started asking him questions about it. And the thing that really sold me on it was when he said, "Yeah, you put a bid on there and then you can set a budget for the day." And I said, "So I can spend $25 a day on leads?" And he said, "Yes." And so we set this all up on Google, and all of a sudden we could find these needles in a haystack. of people who were
Mm-hmm.
looking for information on this all over the United States. And that's what really supercharged the business. And what we found as we started to get leads online was about 10% of people wanted to take their funds and invest it in a business that they were actively going to be a part of running. And you can't do that inside of a self-directed IRA. In fact, we had this great, pre-programmed paragraph that we would read to people to explain to them why in the regulations you couldn't do that. And there was one lead we were talking to one day, and he said, well, yes, I can. I've been working with this, financial advisor in California, and here's what he told me. And so we gathered some more information from this particular prospect because we thought we got to update this explanation that we have for people of why they can't do it.
Yeah.
And we started looking into it. And from our non-lawyer view, it looked legitimate. So we decided we got to go get some professional help.
Mm-hmm.
So we called around to some people we knew, and we found an ERISA attorney. And we said, we want to hire you to look into the ERISA guidelines and look into what this guy is saying and tell us, is this legitimate? Can you invest retirement funds in a business that you're actively going to be a part of if you meet these different requirements that he's talking about? And so he came back and said, yes, here's some things I don't like about how this guy is communicating and what he's saying you can and can't do. He's like, but in general, yes, this has been around since 1974. It's just mostly been high net worth people that have done it with their attorneys. We came to learn with the particular custodian we were working with that there was actually $1 billion IRA that existed at a custodian that we were partners with. You might know the name of this guy. It was Peter Thiel. And you can guess how Peter Thiel got $1 billion IRA because he figured out how to invest his retirement funds in a business that he was going to be a part of. So we made an offer to this ERISA attorney, and we said, we want you to come on to Guidant. We want to hire you to build this part of our business out. We already have people who have this need that are coming to us. We just need someone who can build the infrastructure to deliver it. And so we started helping people start up and set up companies. And this was very early 2004. And fast forward to 2025 now, we've done this for 30,000 plus people all over the United States and most US territories. And we haven't done any of the real estate stuff for 12 or 13 years. We came to a point where we had to decide what the focus of the business was going to be. And so we chopped that part of the business off and sold it off so we could really double down on serving the unique needs of people who wanted to use retirement funds to buy businesses. So that's a very long story, but that's the origin story, Kirsten.
I like it. I've had some clients use their Roth IRAs. Basically, they're taking a loan out of the Roth IRA, but the self-directed IRA, that's interesting. Can you, because I'm not familiar with this term, ERISA. You've used that a few times. Is that an acronym, or what does that stand for?
It is. It's the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. So just a little primer. Back in the day, most of the retirement plans used to be what they called defined contribution. So you'd work for a big company like GM, and they would say, hey, you work for us for 30 years, and when you retire, you're going to get some percentage of your income forever. Those still exist now, but only if you work for the government, because they just don't.
Like a pension.
Exactly. And so in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were all these companies that were going bankrupt, and they were going bankrupt because of these retirement plans that they couldn't properly fund as the market shifted. And so there was a big blow up of a company called Studebaker that no one probably even remembers anymore. It was a car company that went bankrupt for this. There was a lot of pressure on Congress to say, okay, change the laws. And this is when they created the basis that now your IRAs and your 401ks that everyone takes for granted, those came out of this piece of legislation. And what most people don't appreciate is it wasn't like in 1974, Congress passes this and then Charles Schwab the next day is saying, hey guys, we have an IRA. It took a few years for these accounts to sort of become known, and it was IRAs first, and then it was 401ks that started to gain a little notoriety, and then some Roth IRA legislation, which is what you're talking about, came along later. But this is really the foundational regulation that guides sort of the current retirement plans that we all think about when we think about retirement plans.
That's really interesting. So walk me through a little bit of a case study. Yeah. So a client, what when someone calls you up, what does the conversation look like? Is it, hey, I want to invest in a business. I heard this is a vehicle I could potentially use. I mean, is there a percentage you can use against? How does that process work?
Well, as you can imagine, we have some pretty well-trained consultants that help people work through this process. And it's a lot of questions to understand what they're trying to do. Like, tell us about the business. Most businesses are eligible. There are a few kinds of businesses that are not. A business that's primarily the investment of capital, you can't do. So if you wanted to
Okay.
have a business that's just going to do lending, like maybe it's going to do hard money lending on real estate, like that's not going to
Okay.
work because it's going to trip the requirements. It also has to be something that's federally legal. So when people call us up and they say, "Hey, I've got this great new marijuana business I want to start," we say, "We can't help you." Or, "Hey, I want to
Yeah.
start this brothel." We've literally had people do this. "Hey, we have this brothel we want to start." Yeah, we can't do that because this
Even if
is a
it's legal
federal.
in certain states, right? And
Because
I have a banking background, and that's been a topic of conversation over the years as far as how do you bank? How do you bank
Yeah,
those
because
types of
it's the
yeah,
same issue the banks are dealing with. It doesn't matter if the
yeah.
state says it's legal
Yep.
if
You
you're
can't
guided
insure it.
by
You can't.
federal regulations. So we got
Good
to
point.
find out about the business. And then it's a lot of education of helping people understand what are the requirements you have to meet up front and what are the requirements you have to live within going forward in order to be eligible for this. So, like one of the
Mhm.
common ones that comes up, you can only do this with C Corp stock because your
Okay.
retirement plan is essentially buying stock to become an angel investor in this business. And the C Corp is the only type of stock that qualifies. It's the only type of stock where something that's a non person, right? You can't have a pass through like an S corporation that then is
Hmm.
owned by this weird entity called a 401k.
Right.
So we
Okay.
walk
Are
through
there?
all the scenarios, try to
Yeah.
help them understand what their options are, what it's going to cost them, what other avenues that they may consider in terms of funding, right? Is someone going to be eligible for SBA funding? Is seller financing going to be something they could consider? Because at the end of the day, the problem that people are trying to solve when they call us is, hey, I have this transaction I want to do or this dream I want to pursue, and I got to figure out what can I afford and how am I going to make this transaction happen? And there's lots of
Right.
ways to do that. We just happen to be one way that often people are surprised to hear about, and that sometimes opens the door for them to buy a business that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to buy, or
Mhm.
even potentially buy a larger business. In fact, one of the clients I interviewed recently, for him, the thing that had always held him back is he was super successful in his corporate job. Like we're talking $300,000-400,000 a year. So for
Yeah.
him, the idea of making the jump into business ownership, he's like, I just can't do it. I've got
Yeah.
obligations, I've
Leaving
got
the
mortgages.
security of the salary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he needs security of the salary. And what changed for him was he was having, I don't know, drinks with some of his friends, and somebody mentioned the retirement funds, and he thought, oh, wait a second. He's like, I've been cramming all my savings into this retirement plan for years because my employer gives me such great, benefits and matching off of it. He's like, I got $1 million
Yeah.
in there. And what I know with the research I've already done on SBA, if I take this $1 million and I combine it with an SBA loan, all of a sudden I can go buy a $5 million business and I can walk into something that's going to have enough compensation to actually afford me and give me a role that's going to, be interesting and challenging for me.
And then one of the other questions when I ask you, I always, when I sit down with my clients, even from day one, and I'm getting kind of the getting to know you conversation, I always bring up the exit strategy. So how does
Yeah.
that conversation go for you? What does that look like for your clients? So they're, as they're considering investing in a company or business and or whatever, and they have $1 million that they can leverage, so then go buy it and so on and so forth. Basically, they are walking away from that retirement fund income and they're putting it over into a business income that I'm assuming at the end of the day when they retire, they can sell the business, correct? Or keep the business, but maybe hire somebody else to take over management and then they get the residuals or an income stream.
Yeah, if you have $1 million in retirement funds or even $300,000 in retirement funds, and you want to take
Mhm.
that out of your retirement and pay taxes
Mhm.
and penalties, so
Yeah.
you 300,000 becomes 150,000, you don't need us. Like you can go do that on your own. I
Right.
wouldn't recommend
Right.
it, but you can do it.
Yeah.
What we do is we help people structure it in a way where it becomes an asset of your retirement plan, and so you're keeping the tax deferred or tax free nature of your retirement plan, and just instead of owning stock in Tesla or Amazon or Microsoft, you're owning
Yep.
stock in Kirsten Flory Inc. And so
Wow.
you have to treat this like an angel investor in your business, which means when
Hmm.
you go to sell your company, then your 401k gets its pro rata share of the proceeds of that sale. But that goes back into your retirement account. So the benefit of that is that you're not paying taxes on the money that goes into your retirement plan, right? The whole nature of retirement plans is that you're either, in the case of regular deferred retirement plans, you're not paying taxes until you take that money out. Or with the Roth, you're
Exactly.
not paying taxes on it ever, right? Because you've already paid for it
Right.
when you put those funds in.
Hmm. That's very fascinating. And I'm assuming individuals that want to go in this path, they can package things, meaning they can take a little bit out of their self-directed IRA, they can take a little bit out of SBA. I mean, so
Yeah.
they can kind of a la carte it if they want to. Is there any limits of how much they can borrow against or
Well,
take
first,
out?
let me just clarify: it's not borrowing.
Not borrowing,
So there
true.
are
It is
limits on.
reallocating.
Yeah, there are limits to how much you can borrow from your 401k. So you can borrow up to $50,000 from some 401k plans, assuming it represents 50% or less of your total assets. But we're not talking about borrowing. We're talking about it investing in a particular thing. There's no limit on the amount that you can invest in. It just needs to be a
Wow.
good investment, a good deal for the retirement plan. So if you're
Mhm.
thinking to yourself, oh, this is a crappy business deal, I don't want to use my personal savings for this, I'll use my retirement funds. Don't do that. It should be something that you're excited about and you're looking at this as an opportunity to say, hey, if I buy this business and build it up, I'm going to be able to put all this money back into my retirement plan, tax deferred, right? And have it
Wow.
continue to grow over the years.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Give us some examples of some different business and different, clients that you've worked with. What have they gone after? Probably everything, I'm guessing.
Oh my God, so many things. Um, Let me give you a couple examples. One of my favorite interviews I've done recently was a guy who bought a golf course. So he didn't have any intention of being a business owner. He actually worked for ESPN. He loved his job, and he's sitting at dinner with his wife and his family, and he gets a text from his brother, and it's a Craigslist link. And he's looking at it, and his brother sends him this text that says, hey, you want to buy a golf course? And he pulls this thing up, and he's looking at the listing, he's looking at the price this is listed for, and he's like, how is it that somebody is selling a 120-acre golf course for less than the house I'm looking at in West Seattle where he was living? So
Yeah.
he was intrigued, and they drove down to Oregon to Coos Bay where this thing was at, and they, 60 days later they owned a golf course. And he's owned this thing now for 5 or 6 years and has really grown it up and brought it back to being a core part of the community. And I
Okay.
thought, man, that story is so fun. A good example
That's
of somebody buying an existing business.
hmm
Um, we also have lots of clients who will invest in franchises, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
it's somebody who is excited about the opportunity of being a business owner, but they don't want to create everything from scratch,
hmm
right? So they can
hmm
in fact, I talked to a woman the other day who owns a doggy daycare business, right?
Yeah.
Which makes total sense because she was a CTO, right? So why not go from being a CTO to owning a doggy daycare business? Um, but she was really passionate and felt that there was a missing need. It was a need that she felt personally in her market. And so when she went out to look at the options, she found a few franchises, one that she really liked. She ended up moving forward with that and creating that business. And then the other one that we get from time to time are people who do startups. So, in fact, I just talked to a woman the other day who lived in Washington State, and I think she was 60 when she got laid off from her job. And she
Okay.
was an attorney who worked for this firm for a lot of years.
hmm
And so she applied with the state for some support and other things. And the state came back and gave her this letter that basically said, you are unemployable at this point. And
What
so
does
she,
that mean? Because of her age?
yeah, they're basically saying because of your age, you are unemployable, so you are eligible for this particular support thing. And she saw that and she thought, well, then I'm just going to do something that's fun. And
Yeah.
she had a son who was really into sort of brewing his own beer, and she thought, wouldn't it be fun to run a distilling business? And so this woman who's a former attorney decides she's going to learn how to distill alcohol.
Wow. Okay.
And
Okay.
so she starts setting up the component pieces. Well, fast forward 7 or 8 years, she has this amazing business that's right at the entrance to Olympic National Park. And she distills all sorts of unique liquors. And she's bought a bunch of real estate and been part of revitalizing the downtown in this area. She was telling me the other day, she started this once a year event. It's called the Fjorden something or other, but it was from this tradition from 100 years ago where somebody would, take a barrel of some type of whiskey or something, and they would row it out into the middle of the sound and then row it back in. And so they have this big thing where lots of people come to town and they all do this rowing thing
Oh
out,
my
and they
God.
row the whiskey out and they row it back in, and then everybody drinks it and has a great time. And I thought to myself, I like this woman's idea of retirement, right? Like,
That's
do
awesome.
something that's going to keep you engaged and having fun and being connected to a community of people that matter to you.
Yeah, most definitely. What do you find? This is very fascinating. I'm sure a lot of my listeners are probably going to be connected with you saying, how do I do this? Here's what I have. What do you find is the biggest challenge outside of if they have a retirement fund and they have access to that and they qualify? I feel like that's a wonderful first step because a lot of times it's identifying capital. I mean, that's sometimes the biggest challenge. And feeling, whether you have equity in another property or whatever, but understanding where those pockets of funds can come from. But I'm trying to get to my question to you. So hang on for me for a second. After that, what do you
Yeah.
feel makes a successful business owner? Because it's one thing to understand the financial side. I think it's a whole other conversation to understand, okay, do you understand the business metrics enough to understand where the profitability is and how you can grow it to make this thing fly? I mean, do you feel like, you can set them up by channeling them through, the funding mechanism, but do you see them? I mean, what's the success rate of these clients of yours that then go on to buy and grow businesses?
Yeah. So what we find from our clients is they're about 20 to 25% more successful than the data you just see generally out there for people starting businesses. Now,
Okay.
I would love to tell you it's something amazing that Guidant does with these people, but I actually think it's more a reflection of the type of customers that we serve, right? Because they're using retirement funds, and because it usually doesn't make sense to do something like this unless you have more than $100,000 in retirement funds. We're
Sure.
getting a sort of cream of the crop, right? 85% of our clients are 40 years or older. So they already have a bunch of life experience, right?
Hmm.
They're usually well educated and have been in some type of successful professional capacity. So these are smart, capable people. And the
Right.
biggest thing that I see that holds them up is that the thing that's true about people who are 40 and older is we all have something to lose, right? We've got mortgages and we've got aging parents who maybe didn't do a good job saving. We've got kids that want to go to college, which is ridiculous right now. My son tells me he wants to go to the University of Michigan, which is like $85,000 out of state. So, almost $400,000 to send somebody just for the undergraduate.
Right.
And then we'll
Exactly.
see if he wants to
Hmm.
go further. So there's all these pulls on your time. And so I think it's really the golden handcuffs that create the biggest issue is that these people are successful and often unhappy or unfulfilled in what they're doing. And
Hmm.
what often holds them in place is that they have to take a risk on something that maybe is not as certain as the certainty of what they don't love, but they're getting today financially.
Yeah.
And
Do you ever have
that's where, go ahead.
do you ever have clients that come to you that they don't know exactly what they want to invest in or business, but they love this idea?
Totally. I mean, we get people all over the spectrum. Some people come to us and we're the first stop on their journey where they're like,
Mm.
I didn't even think that this would be a possibility for me, but I want to understand this because if I do and it's a possibility, then I'll start putting in the work to find a business. And then we get people who are, hey, I got to close in 2 weeks, right? And so it's like, okay, wait a second.
Right.
Let's
Zip, zip.
you got to
I know.
understand where your funds are right now because 2 weeks may not actually be realistic depending on what's going on.
Right. How that all
Um,
works.
so we get them all across the spectrum. But what we don't do is we don't help people vet or pick what things to invest in. Like our
Right.
expertise is not saying this is the right business investment for you. Our expertise is saying if you want to buy a business, like we're the best at helping you understand how to do it if you want to use retirement funds. And if you don't want to use retirement funds, awesome. We're happy to give you an education and help you understand this is an option because we recognize it's not going to work for everybody. Some people
Yeah.
love it. Some people have lots of other options. I talked to a guy the other day who bought a medical device company in Florida, and he had all sorts of assets. And I was like, "Why didn't you borrow the money or use some of your personal savings?" And
Mhm.
he's like, "I didn't want to have debt on this." He's like, "I didn't want that pressure of having to make that payment." He's like, I've got these funds that have been saved for long-term return. I'd rather use those funds for this business investment because then I can have the right mentality that's connected to what I'm trying to do with them. And I thought, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way.
That's a very unique way of looking at it, really. I know, I mean, even for myself personally in my businesses that I own and properties that I own, I'm constantly reevaluating leverage. and
Yeah.
I also am a firm believer in, even though I might have cash in the bank or access to equity, I'm like, how can I put this deal together for one, the lowest risk possible for myself and the least amount of cash in my own pocket? Because I feel like I always want to be, and every year, especially during tax time, we talk about, as I'm prorating for next year and making some plans and adjustments and things like that. I always want to make sure I have cash flow and emergency funds out there because stuff happens, whether it's a rental property I own and I have to go replace an air conditioning unit or who knows, I want to hire a new staff member.
And you're smart, Kirsten, and it's something that I think we all kind of intuitively get is that the people who have greater cash reserves are more successful. So earlier when
Right.
I was saying I'd love to tell you that it's something that Guidant does that makes the difference, I really think
Yeah.
it's two factors. It's these people are already, maybe 80th percentile in terms of people across the US. And I think in addition to that, they're bringing more cash to the table regardless of
Mhm.
how they're operating, and so therefore that puts them in a position to be more successful. And there's a bunch of
Yeah.
research that supports that I could share with you if you want to put in your show notes.
Do you have more men or women as clients?
It's going to be disappointing to say this, but there are far more male entrepreneurs just across the board. And I know this not
Mhm.
just from what we do at Guidant, but I've also been a part of the entrepreneur organization for 20 plus years. And
Yeah.
it is the same challenge for us recruiting more women because there are not as many female business owners. Now, one of the things we do get with Guidant with a disproportionate amount compared to, just typical startups or other businesses, we get a lot of
Mhm.
couple entrepreneurs,
Okay. Okay.
a lot of wife and husband who decide, hey, we're gonna come together and we're gonna buy this bed and breakfast, or we're gonna the woman I told you that was the attorney, she did this
Uh-huh.
with her husband, right? The two of them
Okay.
decided this is how we want to spend our retirement. We want to build this distillery right at the entrance to Olympic National Park and give a purpose to our life, not in what we're just trying to build, but an opportunity to sort of connect with people on a regular basis, just to keep us sharp and connected.
That's great. I'm so glad to hear that. But kind of going back to your earlier comment
Yeah,
about how there's more male entrepreneurs, why
yeah,
do you think that is? Men versus women. I loved your explanation of why middle age,
yeah.
you have more to lose, but I think you're more savvy and a little more stabilized. But why do you think it's men over women?
Man, this is answering the question like this is more likely to get me in trouble than it is to,
Oh,
because the reality is I don't know, Kirsten, because I don't think it's a capability issue. And I don't
no.
think it's an experience issue. In fact, the female entrepreneurs I know are often super, super talented. And if you gave me a male and a female counterpart and they had equal experience, I would almost always hire the female, right? Just
That's
from
great. Yeah,
what my intuition has showed me over the years in terms of dependability and longevity at the business. And maybe that's a bad thing for entrepreneurship. I don't know. Maybe they're sticking in jobs longer. Maybe the willingness to take a risk is not there. And maybe it's a little bit of our society that I think glorifies entrepreneurship more for men than it does for women. I think there
probably.
might be a little stigma of judgment sometimes. I know my
Mhm.
wife has gotten that from time to time, like, hey, why are you out here running this business when you should be at home with your kids?
Exactly. It's funny when I went into real estate 12 years ago, I actually and I've always worked and I have 2 kids. I'm a mom. But, my kids were in daycare and after school care and all that kind of stuff, and my husband works full time. But it's funny, when I made the switch into real estate, I think you hit the nail on the head. Even though real estate is kind of entrepreneurial in a way, even though I was working for another brokerage, I got asked a lot of people said, "Oh, are you doing this so you can stay home with your kids?" I said, "No." And I've never worked harder in my life. But it's funny. You're right. If for whatever reason, the older that we get and the new, generations that come up behind us and how gender roles are, displaced, it's still funny. I personally would love to give more females the confidence to go into business for themselves. And I'm so glad we're talking today because there are so many tools and pathways if they just ask the right questions. And I think a lot of women are scared to ask the right question. I think they don't want to sound silly or like they don't know what they're doing. Um, and I think it's probably just a personality disposition kind of thing. So thank you for, sharing that perspective. I don't think you're going to get in trouble at all, but I want to hope empower women. You're right. I think women, especially in investing in general, I think they're much more thoughtful for how they can have impact. And if they're truly going to put their foot down and get invested financially, emotionally, physically into something, I think they're going to do it with their whole heart and with everything they've got. and probably work their tail off to make sure it doesn't fail, which is interesting. But I think that's also scary, a scary position to be in.
Yeah, and I think you're highlighting something worth pointing out, and that's there's strength in humility as a business owner, because once you think you know it all, you make assumptions about what's true and you don't test those things. And I
Right.
can tell you, having been an entrepreneur since in my early 20s, when you make assumptions about what's true, like you're going to be wrong more than half the time. And it's going to be real painful. And if you're lucky, you're going to survive those. So people who have that humility to say, hey, I don't know. And so I'm going to pull in some experts and I'm going to try and learn and I'm going to test my ideas in smaller ways before I go big. Those are the people that usually succeed. You would ask me that question before. To me, the ones that succeed, the pattern that I see is that they've found ways to de-risk becoming business owners. And there's lots of
Mhm.
different ways I've seen people do that. One of my favorites are when people find ways to test it, right? So one of my favorite stories is Eric Torres Garcia. He was a local kid that I got introduced to, just a young entrepreneur. And, he, after college, he went on an internship to Europe and he was fascinated by the company that he worked for. It was Kinder. So, Kinder eggs, you probably see them
Oh,
now.
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
When you go through Europe, they have all these little toys inside.
Hmm.
But what he didn't realize was when you go to Europe, they do everything in a Kinder like egg. Like you can get a full bottle of wine in an
Oh my
egg.
gosh.
Right. So they do all sorts of stuff. And so he's looking at this and going, this is amazing. There's all sorts of food issues in the US of why they don't allow people to do this. But he had that in the back of his mind as he was playing through different ideas of what kind of business he could start. And then all of a sudden one day he saw a bath bomb and he thought, and it all came together for him. He's like, what if I could create the bath bomb of hot cocoa? And so
Mm.
immediately went to the store and he bought, some cheap chocolate and some marshmallows and like a couple little molds. And he went home and he played around with how to build this prototype for what he eventually called Cocoa Bomb. So he builds this prototype and then he's like, well, I'm going to put this online and see what people do.
Hmm.
So, he films this video and he's a younger guy. So he's got a little bit of influencer in his blood. And so he puts on, Mariah Carey's "All I Want for Christmas," the most overdone Christmas song of all time. And
Uh-huh.
he's filming and he pops this thing in the glass of warm milk and he videos this and he drops it on TikTok, which at the time was relatively new but was kind of blowing
Hmm.
up. And within a couple of hours, he's getting a lot of comments. People are like, "What is that? Where did you get it?" And so he pulls it down and he's like, oh man, he's like, I think people might be interested, but I got to figure out if this really makes sense. So he took the next weekend and he went and set up a Shopify website on a 2-week trial. He didn't even have to pay for it.
Wow.
Set it up to be able to take transactions via their merchant thing. And then, the following week, he reposted the video with this link to this website that he had just set up. And then he went off and he was, doing something for dinner or whatever. And then all of a sudden his phone is like, ping. And then 5 minutes later, ping. It's pinging him every time he gets a sale. And pretty soon
Uh-huh.
it's like ping, 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 ping. And all of a sudden he realizes, oh no, I have no idea how I'm going to build this. I've never made more than a prototype from these cheap grocery store ingredients. So he goes and he pauses this thing, but he realizes he's already sold $8,000 worth of cocoa bombs. So now he's
No.
panicking. He's
Yeah.
reaching out to his entrepreneurship professor at BSU. He's calling his mom. He's talking to everyone that he knows.
Probably
And
thinking, how can I set up an assembly line in my garage and a card table or something like
he's
that?
got no entity. He's got no nothing. But his
Yeah.
his mom helps him figure out, hey, we can the church that they go to, let them borrow their commercial kitchen. And so they rounded up a couple of friends to do the first production thing. And his entrepreneurship professor at BSU connected him to an attorney and to a local guy that had a candy store to sort of be a mentor. And now this kid has a multi-million-dollar business and he employs like 25 people in this little hometown of Blackfoot, Idaho that he's from, that he's sort of brought this, industry to, all
Yeah.
because he was able to put together this idea. And what I love about his story is that I think a lot of people think you got to have all the pieces in place. I got to have the right entity structure. I got to have the right attorney. I got to have the right CPA. I got to have all this. And they forget that every business is driven by having a customer. Like if you can figure
Mhm.
that part out, all the other stuff is relatively easy in the grand scheme of things. So I love
Absolutely.
his story because I think it shatters this idea that we need to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars every time to figure out whether we got something that's worth investing in.
Absolutely. I'm glad you bring that up about not having to have everything figured out. I'm just finishing up reading the book. You've probably read it, Who Not How by
Yeah,
Dan
love it.
Sullivan and
I
Ben
read it
Hardy.
every year.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's the simplest concept, but it helps entrepreneurs take a step back out of I don't have to do everything. I'm not here to do all the pieces, and I don't have to have it all figured out. I know what the end goal gets to look like. And then finding those right mentors, people that do it better than you and being okay with that, and keep taking that step forward. That's really good for him. That's really awesome.
Well, and I think what you point out about who, not how is important to acknowledge because most of the people who end up becoming business owners, they're really good problem solvers, right? And they've
Yes.
been good problem solvers in their jobs and other places. And so the things that they've been rewarded for are figuring it out and solving it for themselves. That's what people
Hmm.
have patted them on the back for since they were in fourth grade. And
Right.
so it's a real mind shift that has to happen at some point in the scale of your business. You have to start looking at every component of it and saying, wait a second, if I continue to do this, I am going to cap the opportunity that's here. Like, who can do this better than me in
Right.
some cases? And in a lot of other cases, it's who can do this 80% as good as me? Because almost always with business owners, there are 1,000 things that they can do better than the various employees that they have. And it makes it really hard for them to let go and grow their company instead of saying, hey, the things that are not absolutely critical to the business, like how can I let go of some of those things and be okay with
Yeah.
80% or be okay with the time it's going to take someone else to learn? I tell people this all the time. If someone had looked at me at 25 and were interviewing me for the roles that I took in these companies I started, no one would have hired me because I had
Sure.
no idea what I was doing.
Probably all say that. I know. Yeah.
I had no idea what I was doing. And I figured it out as I went. But that's how everyone has to learn to some extent. So the same way that you learn and pick things up through, making some mistakes, it's harder for a business owner because the difference is you're accountable even when you're not in control.
Hmm. I know several of my clients. I mean, I have a whole host of small business owners, and a lot of them are solopreneurs, you know, individual, husband and wife, small companies. Um, what I find, they are so hesitant, one, to hire any help because they see it as an expense and not as an opportunity. And I'm
Yep.
thinking, well, you have to get your mindset right to be like, I can't grow but for this. I need to take this off my plate. I mean, I even, blame myself sometimes, and I'm now hiring too, but even things as like taking out the trash and coordinating your vendor relationships. I'm like, I make way too much money when it comes down to it. It's like if I look at my annual salary or my, hourly wage, I'm like, I make way too much money to be taking the trash out. I make way too much. I make really. And there's probably somebody else who can do it much more efficiently and effectively than I can that takes that off my plate. And it's hard sometimes for me to convince my clients as we're having these conversations. They're like, I feel like there's so much opportunity. And I'm like, there is. You have to get out of your own way. Because
Yeah.
when you're ready to retire and sail off into the sunset and enjoy your time and get the profits from your business that you just grown, you are the business. So unless you're willing to get out of the business and make it run without you, you don't have a company you can sell. Because
Yeah.
it's hard, like you just said, if somebody's taking over an existing business that's retiring and they say, oh yeah, it's very profitable. I have a auto mechanic right now that is in the process of retiring. And he's like, there's not, and he's a specialty in the auto mechanic world. And so he's like, when I was up and running, I had a staff of 6. I was taking home, my salary was pushing $200,000 a year, but I love what I do. And I was in the business every day. But nowadays, nobody wants to work that hard. Nobody wants to manage that staff and do those intricacies that I do, which is sad because if you think about it, and I'm in Kansas, a $200,000 a year salary is a heck of a salary and a heck of a life. But
Yeah.
it's he understood, I think, and he's thankfully comfortable enough, and he owns the building, that no one's going to buy me out. I've tried. They just don't want that. But I think he's saying if it was 20 years ago, maybe I should have mentored somebody up to take that over for me little by little, so I could have that exit strategy and sell the business in addition to the real estate. But
Yeah.
it's just lessons learned. But I always encourage people, I'm like, if you think you have something of value to sell and it's not a physical asset like a piece of equipment or a piece of real estate, you have to figure out a way to remove yourself. And it might take years, but it's tough. I've seen it happen so many times again where then the value of the company isn't there.
Yeah,
And that's
that is
sad.
tough. But your client did something really smart, which was when you have an existing stable business, one of the best things you can do to diversify your risk is buy the building.
Buy the
At least
building.
you're going to pay
Right.
somebody for the
Right.
business you have. And it's a fantastic inflation hedge as well.
Oh my gosh. I'm finding too different industries. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this too. I worked several medical practitioners, younger physicians. I had a medical group a few years ago, two older doctors, two younger doctors. The whole thought was, well, when the two older doctors retired, they would sell the practice to the younger doctors, which happened. But the two older doctors also owned the building. And they said, and ideally they stayed on as landlords for a while and then took a rental income. And they're like, hey guys, hey, younger doctors that bought the practice, don't you want to buy the building? They wanted nothing to do with it. And it surprised them. Well, and they ended up partnering and selling the practice to the hospital system in the area. They're like, we just want to be employees. We just want to, go home at the end of the day and not have to worry about maintenance and like, well, our office manager helps handle that. But it's
Interesting.
just, it blew my mind. And they're physicians, they're making a nice living
Yeah.
and have all the perks that go along with that. I don't know whether it was just a generational thing. I've seen this happen in other medical practices too. It's like you have an opportunity to grow your wealth in lots of different lanes and pockets and have that diversification for if maybe something happens to you, you can't practice medicine anymore, or who knows? I mean, other circumstances happen, but you have other pockets of passive income that you can tap into. And it's interesting.
I
So,
love
and maybe
it.
they'll change their mind when they get to middle age. I don't know.
Yeah, I love that you brought up that example because I think it highlights a common trap that I see new entrepreneurs fall into, which is, somebody who's a doctor, right? They get into that line of work because they want to help heal people, right? That's
Sure.
what they do, that's what they're passionate about. Well, being a business owner is a whole different set of skills. It's another job, it's another hat to wear, and it's different. It requires different things. And what I see from a lot of new entrepreneurs is they don't recognize the shift when you go from employee to owner. If you don't like your job, it's on you. Like, you get to change it.
Yeah.
You get to decide what things you hire for, how you structure the business. And I think too often people are buying businesses that aren't a fit, meaning the thing that the business needs to really move forward is not a fit for what they are good at and like to do,
Hmm.
or it's staring them right in the face and they're just not making the changes to go, hey, these are the places I really add great value. And so they keep taking out the trash, even though they hate it, but they don't recognize that somewhere out there in the world, there's somebody who loves taking out the trash for you. That took
Right.
me a long time to figure out. I used to feel so bad about delegating administrative detailed tasks because I hate them. I
Right.
absolutely hate them. And so I would feel guilty giving them to people until I realized like there's a whole world of people who love nothing more than to feel needed and wanted because they are amazing at that and they can do it 1,000 times better than me. And they love being able to contribute to something bigger than themselves by being able to do the thing that they love and are great at. And I don't think I appreciated that for a long while. And that
Yeah.
to me is the key for the who, not how. Like, how do you put yourself
Absolutely.
in the place where it's much easier for you because the things you already are wired to want to do are the things that are going to push your business forward.
That's huge. That's great advice. And thank you for, I mean, I'm pointing right at myself too. I was in that situation too. Cause you're learning along the way and you're questioning things. You're like, is this right? And there's no rule book. I sometimes joke with friends and colleagues. I'm like, I wish there were, I'm totally going to date myself. When I was, younger and having babies, and they had this book called What to Expect and You're Expecting. I'm sure it's now all online and there's an app for it. But like every step along the way told you exactly what, oh, this was or that was, or how do you handle that? And I joke, I'm like, I wish there was that for, there probably is, there's great business books out there, but something that's that complete and all in there. You just look up the thing. This is what I do. This is exactly what I do. And there's not that because there's no right answer. But identifying your strengths and getting out of your own way, I think is the most powerful thing you can do as a business owner.
But that's a great example too, because what to expect when you're expecting is super helpful before you have a kid. I
Yes.
read it too
Yeah.
before we had
Yeah.
our first, which was my son. Um, but every kid is different. Like you think you got it figured out, and then the next kid comes along and blows everything out of the water, right? And you got to, and that's exactly how a business is, right? You can
Uh-huh.
read every book that's out there. You're never going to have it all figured out. So there's a certain amount of being able to live with some uncertainty and being able to have confidence, not that you have the right answer, but that you will figure it out over time.
Love it. I love it. Jeremy, thank you for your time today. This has been a great conversation. What is the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you?
So if they want to get in touch with me directly, probably the best way is to just DM me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
But if you want to
We'll put
learn
that in
more,
the show notes.
what's that?
Yeah. We'll put that in the show notes. We'll put that link there.
Right. And if you want to just learn more about rollovers for business startups, just go to our website, guidantfinancial.com. That's GUIDANT financial.com. We have tons of educational resources on the site that you can access that are about far more than just how you can use retirement funds to invest in businesses. We also have stuff about, SBA lending and all the other things that are around this idea of how you figure out how to pay for and get into a business if that's your dream.
I love it. Thank you. Well, thank you for your time today. This is very, and I need to research this for my own. I mean, I'm fascinated, so I'll probably be in touch, but thank you again.
Great. You're welcome.